When you try to summarize a person's life in just a couple of words, one of the things that comes to mind with Bob is integrity. In all things that he did, integrity was at the core.
My father has great resilience and optimism. He just does. Who he is at his core, he has just always been.
My father is Norwegian, my mother's German. She came here with her father at a time when it was just assumed that if the father got a citizenship, everybody did. She spoke English perfectly.
He absolutely adored the way he was raised and adored his parents, who were both immigrants. And so very much he wanted always to kind of raise his children the way that they had been raised.
Harvard was announcing that in an effort to widen their base, they were going to offer scholarships to in the Middle West and California, far west. The teacher just said, "I think you ought to apply for this." And I was always one to look at the fine print and find out at the bottom that you had to take the national board examinations, whatever they were called. And I said, "Well, there's the trick. I mean, that's $20 right there." Well, he shamed me. He offered to pay it. So I took the test and forgot about it. Anyway, one day, on the last day of school, and I'm out there with the others and sweating. It's June, and all of a sudden the principal's secretary comes running out and he says, Robert, Dr. Hastings is here to see you." He'd come from Harvard. I'd forgotten all about it. It was really very funny because he wanted to know what my favorite reading was. And I said, "Oh, there's a little 2-paragraph short story on the last page of the newspaper every day." That was not the way to sell yourself. And he wondered why I wanted to come to Harvard. And I said, "Well, I don't actually. I mean, the teacher sort of argued me into making the application." There was one thing and another. I mean, it was a 1-hour conversation that couldn't have been dreamed up by a comedian.
My parents met folk dancing, and they were great folk singers. And we didn't get stories at bedtime. We all got to choose a song. And that was my dad, and he really, truthfully can't carry a tune in a bucket. And my mother could have been a concert violinist, but what they had in common was their love of dancing. And apparently my father was, well, this is the story of how they met. It was the war, and they were at a YWCA, folk dancing. And my father had asked somebody else to dance, and it was a hambo, I think, a Swedish hambo, which is apparently quite unusual and not easily mastered. And so this very tall woman with whom my father was dancing started dancing the hambo, and in the middle leaned over and called to her friend, "Hey, Ella, this one can dance the hambo." And the rest, as they say, is history. So Lori, Eric, Linda, Norman, Bjorn, Curtis, Catherine, Earl, Allison, and Elikari. And I can do that because the other part of going to bed every night was saying your prayers and God bless Lori, Eric, Linda, Norman, Bjorn, Curtis, Catherine, Earl, Allison. And so there's a whole slew of Christmas traditions. Everybody who worked with him certainly came to our house for a Santa Lucia party at one time or another. Another tradition that they got from Sweden. But in Sweden, the tradition is that on December 13th, the oldest daughter would dress as Lucia and everybody would trail behind her. And so, of course, in our family, that was a big trail. And she would go into the father's room and bring breakfast to him in bed. And I will tell you that I believe the last time my father said, "Oh, I stayed a little late in bed this morning because I thought Santa Lucia might come," was probably 2 years ago. I think, and this is one of the things that I really deeply respect about my dad, 2 things: of being cherished and of dependability. You could depend on my dad coming home at night, having ridden his bike home without any gloves, sticking his hand down your shirt and saying, "Ooh, it's so cold outside," or rubbing up against your face with his 5 o'clock shadow and saying, "You need to shave." It was predictable and it was repetitive, but it gave you a sense of both being cherished and being secure.
Many of his discoveries really are core to the foundation of our molecular understanding of how cells and the body works. And he was right there at the forefront as all of these things that my generation takes for granted. He's the one that laid that foundation for us.
I had access to the first radioactive carbon that was available to civilians. I determined the mechanism by which a certain chemical reaction, the Loftfield interpretation of the Pravorsky reaction, that was work that I began almost the first week I got out of the Army, in fact. The physicians sort of outlined how nice it would be to have radioactive amino acids. Well, I told them how easy it would be to make some alanine, an amino acid, and I went home to work on my Pravorsky. About 3 months later, Dr. Aub calls Dr. Evans and says in a rather hostile voice, "If that young man of yours is so good and thinks it's so easy, why doesn't he do it?" So I did make it and delivered it, and then I and my wife went skiing, and we got a telegram back in the days when you got telegrams, and it said, "We have just demonstrated for the first time ever synthesis of protein in a non-intact body."
He really felt a calling to come to New Mexico, and he felt a calling to start the school here.
Fitz contacted me, and I said, well, I was struck by his interest in developing a new teaching method. Fitz came in and told me they weren't going to have any biochemistry the first year if they couldn't get me. And my physician told him to go to hell, get out of the room. And I just decided that, all right, this does it. I'll move to Albuquerque, we'll figure out how to handle things. I felt ashamed of myself at having a talent that they wanted, that I thought I could fulfill.
Really tried to sort of make the department more or less like a family. He was excited about teaching, and in fact there were times when we would tell him to sit down and let some of us do some of the teaching instead of doing it all himself.
It was lighthearted in a way, but deeply serious in a different way. I mean, there was this family relationship that was, I think it was very, very productive.
I can remember one time when he'd invited a speaker, and the speaker gave a talk. And I noticed that Bob's eyes were closing a little bit, as all of our eyes are apt to do every once in a while. And the talk was over, and I was wrong again. He asked a question about specifically the place where his eyes had started to close. And I think it was almost as though he had started to close them in thinking, so-and-so has some contrary data here. I wonder which one. And so he asked that question. You would have said, "Oh, he's dozing off." And the answer was, no, that wasn't a doze off at all.
My father is this terribly reflective person who I say he likes to take stock. We call it collecting his people. So when he used to drive across the country and he misses it terribly, he would take a southern route going out so he could stop and visit all of the friends and anybody he's ever known on his way across the country. And then he'd have to take a northern route on the way back so he could collect all of his people on the way back. I mean, and right up until the end, he was visiting the minister who gave him his confirmation at age 16. I mean, the kinds of connections that he built, it's extraordinary. And the reason he goes back and visits the minister who confirmed him in the Lutheran Church is because he feels that man is an integral part of who he is and played an important role in his development. And I think he feels that way about everybody who's worked with him. You totally get the kind of bright, scientific kind of mind, but it's not as frequent that it would be accompanied by all of those other characteristics, that great fondness for staying connected with people and also being really truly sentimental. I think sometimes painfully so for him.
I think our field oftentimes selects for people that are ego-driven, that are thinking about their own career advancement, and true in all fields, not just in science, but to have that level of unselfishness, to commit their entire career to knowledge through scientific discovery, to students through his unselfish activities both inside and outside the classroom and inside and outside the institution, and to his community.
He said to me last night, "I still don't understand why they're doing this, why they've chosen me."
He is given so much. He is a incredible positive reflection of all that we as an institution and as faculty members should aspire to be.
The world has been awfully good to me, in spite of my best efforts to resist its kindness. I am constantly humbled by the unearned gifts of being born Christian and American. In every case, and in dozens more, it is clear that the circumstances pressed on me or forced on me have tremendously enriched my life and prepared me for the next unanticipated adventure.